As I say, we've got Dr. Bernard Stacey this evening to talk to us about Daniel Tokenhouse. I can't do better by way of introducing Bernard than to say what he says himself on his personal website. Born at the age of 40 and half a century too late, Bernard avoided expulsion from school and found himself, some years later, unexpectedly in possession of a medical degree and also with an urge to write. For reasons he cannot remember, he found himself serving in Her Majesty's forces for a time, though now ekes a living tending to the sick. Literary composition is somewhat curtailed by his current employer's quite unreasonable expectation that he attends work every day. But despite these intolerant demands, he still finds time to pen a line or two, and he reads whenever not asleep, drinking. He lives in the heart of the New Forest with his wife and daughter and drives what he fondly imagines to be a Bentley, but is manifestly nothing of the sort. Bernard is a leading gastroenterologist based down on the south coast and has been a trustee of the society for a few years and took on the possibly unenviable task of being chairman last autumn. So, Bernard, tell us about Dan Tokenhouse. I think a much overlooked character, but certainly some interesting elements.
If you can see that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, excellent. So Daniel Tokenhouse, then, certainly one of my favourite minor characters in dance, and right from the outset, I'm, as a writer, always fascinated by how other writers find names for their characters, and I think AP was particularly superlatively good at this. It's hard to know how he arrived at Tokenhouse because the only real reference to Tokenhouse is Tokenhouse Yard in the city, which is the site of an old token house, a house, a 15th century house where merchants used to give tokens for small amounts of money. This was before the wider invention of or distribution of copper coinage. It doesn't seem to have much to do with our character, but because of my inexplicable passion for finding unlikely and possibly very improbable links, I like to think that AP, with his knowledge of London, also knew that Tokenhouse Yard was where a painter called Charles Brooking used to live, and that maybe gave him the hint that Tokenhouse should spend his latter years as a painter. Brooking, however, was a marine painter, so this wouldn't be what Tokenhouse painted. In fact, he may be exactly what Duport collected in his seascapes. Anyway, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, why Tokenhouse? He's a fairly minor character. He really only appears briefly, could be quite easily forgotten after a single read-through. Certainly was forgotten by the Channel 4 1997 production, where, to my chagrin, he didn't feature at all. Well, quite simply because I found him a very interesting character with whom I felt I had some affinity. Many years ago, when the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, pictured here, had an outing to the Reichenbach Falls, all the members were asked to bid for whom they would like to dress up as. And I always felt that if the Anthony Powell Society did a similar trip, maybe not to Switzerland, but possibly to Hyde Park Corner or something, I would bid to be Tokenhouse. Besides which, I don't think I could compete with maybe the giants of the society like Keith and Robin, who clearly want to be vying to be Pamela. So I would go as Tokenhouse. So what do we know of him? Well, he does only appear in one of the 12 books. In the 11th one, Temporary Kings, set in 1958, written or published in 1973. And we know that he has a slightly reluctant career in the army, ending as a major, another reason why I feel some affinity towards him. And he took little or no active part in the First World War because he was recovering from typhoid, and he took little or no part in the Second because he had a psychiatric breakdown in 1939 that required hospitalization and invaliding out. We know that he inherits enough money to buy himself into a publishing firm, and he's Nick's first boss. But we only really encounter him in Venice in his latter years as an artist at the time that Nick is attending the conference. And during that, in that book, we encounter him really in 7 scenes, highlighted here in bold. There's a masterful introduction in chapter 1, where AP, through Nick's voice, gives us the salient points of Tokenhouse's history. Then there's the telephone call where Nick and Tokenhouse arrange their meeting. Sorry, there's some background noise going on at the moment. I wonder if people could turn off their microphones.
Don't know where it.
I'll carry on. And after the telephone call, Nick gets to the flat or studio, is shown some of his pictures. Then the two of them set off to the Biennale, where, of course, they meet Ada and Glober, have lunch in the 5th scene. Then all of them go back to the flat for what's supposed to be a private view. And then there's a short phone call at the end. And in those 7 scenes, we're given in sequence aspects of his history, his character, his own views on art and politics. Then at the Biennale, his wider views on art and politics. At lunch, we see some aspects of his social relationships, or trouble with them. Then more politics and character traits in the flat. And again, in the phone call at the end, and we learn about his communist sympathies. We learn that he is, in short, a fellow traveller. So let's go through these scenes. In the introduction, which we see through the eyes of Nick, we learn that at one point, Tokenhouse wanted to have a career in the church, or at least considered a career in the church. But because of a pronouncement of a bishop with which he disagreed, he decided to ditch that and do what his family wanted and join the army. And he took on an extremely anti-clerical attitude from that point on, to the extent that he was delighted on the day that he meets Nick that he'd received a letter detailing that, or agreeing to the fact that he would not have any religious rites at his funeral. So he follows an army career, but even that quite reluctantly. He is, I think, unique amongst dance characters insofar as he has a somewhat sexless life. There's no mention of any liaisons, male or female. And he seems to travel through life entirely on his own. And I can't think of any other character where you could say that. From the quite exotic sexual scenes that we know about, of course, to the very prosaic, like Mrs. Widmerpool, the mother, I mean, not Pamela, who is married, has a child. But even so, no one else, I think, has a sexless life. And he has a very independent, solitary life. We're introduced to the thrifty side of his character as he advises Nick's father to buy the French edition of Pennell's Life of Whistler because it has the same quality plates but lower cost. This is, of course, the set of books that's deposited into Dieppe Harbour when the carrying strap of the case breaks. And he's with Nick's father at Sandhurst, where they share an interest in the arts and in arguing. AP says that as far as arguing goes, they could each, quote, give themselves a game, give each other a game. Nick's father was always puzzled by Tokenhouse's early wish to publish what he called picture books, which, of course, in a way, is what he ended up doing. He developed typhoid or enteric fever quite early on in his career. So through no particular fault of his own, he was rather left in a series of mundane, colourless jobs that advanced him no higher than major. And then when he inherited some money, we're not told how much, but sufficient to leave the army and be financially independent and to buy himself into a publishing house, that's what he did. And throughout all this time and throughout the rest of his life, painting was his sole relaxation. He finally parts with Nick's father acrimoniously over a disagreement of Munich, one being pro-appeasement and the other not. And so we come to Venice, and there's a telephone call where Nick has already sent a postcard to Tokenhouse warning him in advance, just in case Tokenhouse wanted to avoid him, but it doesn't. And Tokenhouse makes a point when he answers the phone to demonstrate that he's an early riser. Nick is in bed, and Tokenhouse is keen to say, oh, I've already been up painting. And he's also proud that he lives in a part of Venice that's completely off the beaten track. He takes pride in being a local, being of the people, not being in that grand canal area where Nick's hotel is. He wants to distance himself from the sort of the bourgeois scene of Venice. And then he gives Nick detailed directions to his flat And I'm just going to read this from the book because it becomes relevant later on. He went over directions with that pedantic attention to detail natural to him, dilated by army training. Have you got it? Remember, an accelerato. When you disembark, turn to the right, walk straight on, then bear left, left again, then right, not left, remember, and then right again. It's over a greengrocer's. Walk straight up. Very detailed stuff. But bear it in mind. It may come up again. When it gets to the flat, which he finds quite easy to get to, he finds it a very austere, neat and tidy thing, not at all like a studio, with overtones of a clerical atmosphere, which clearly Tokenhouse doesn't want. And Tokenhouse's dress has a very military atmosphere, which he also doesn't really want. He's wearing a thick tweed jacket and punctiliously pressed flannels. And we're further introduced to the solipsistic, solitary nature of Tokenhouse. He comes out with the extraordinary line that says, most of the people I used to know are dead. I find that makes little difference to my life. And you just think, what sort of life have you led where the people that you know dying makes little difference to you? He really does exist in his own solitary little universe. Anyway, then he shows Nick some examples of his painting. And Nick, for a while, is baffled as to what he can say. When he last saw Tokenhouse, the painting was of the sort of Camden Group style, quite formalist. And he says, as far as the art of Daniel Tokenhouse was concerned, the Camden Group had been entirely swept away and been replaced with a sort of neo-primitivism. He sees some possible links with frescoes. And of course, Tokenhouse is aiming at a very political statement. He's trying to paint in a socialist realist painting style. Here's an example of his four priests rigging a miracle. Greys, browns and blacks predominate, not very effective recession, but clearly a political, or in this case, anti-religious statement. Quick plug, if anyone wants to read more about Tokenhouse's view on art, there is a book, of course, written by the great man himself, available on the club website. So that would be a useful addition to anyone's library, I'm sure. So the two of them go off to the Biennale, and Tokenhouse grabs his walking stick. Now, it's not unusual for a mid-70-year-old man to grab a walking stick, but then AP also describes it as an ash plant walking stick, which I found fascinating. The only other instance of an ash plant walking stick in literature that I know about, of course, is Stephen Dedalus' in Ulysses, ash being a magical conduit between two worlds. That doesn't really link much with Tokenhouse, but then when we consider his hat, here again, it's me forming links that I would like to see that may not exist, but Tokenhouse's hat is a grey hat of which he turns the brim down, which is a very curious thing to do if you've got a hat where the brim is already turned up. Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses and also before wears what's called a Latin Quarter hat, which is a black hat with the brim turned up. So rather than a black hat with the brim turned up, we have a grey hat with the brim turned down, linked by an ash plant. And I wondered if AP was trying to tell us that this was the portrait of the artist as an older man. Anyway, off they go, Tokenhouse clattering along in his hobnail boots very quickly, always afraid of being late. And he asks Nick about Dr. Zhivago, whether he's read Dr. Zhivago, published the year before. And it got me wondering why AP chose the 1958 Biennale exhibition, because at this point in the dance sequence, the years aren't quite so crucial as they are at the beginning, where one school year follows another and the university years obviously follow straight away. Here, there's a little bit more laxity. So why did he choose 1958? And I think the main reason is that it's generally accepted that the 1958 Venice Biennale was a watershed for that exhibition because it was the first time that abstract art almost entirely dominated, whereas before it was really one of a mix. Of course, it also gives them the opportunity to bring in Dr. Zhivago, published the year before, Pasternak's novel about the effects of the Russian Revolution on a bourgeois family, which in fact was not published in the Soviet Union until 1987. So it was still unpublished at the time that AP wrote this book. We then get some more indications that Tokenhouse may have another side to him when he inquires about Dr. Belkin, who of course also forms a large part of Widmerpool's Venetian journey. But he doesn't seem too concerned about whether he's there or whether he's not. And it makes one wonder whether he's either a very lackadaisical spy or a phenomenally good one. Now, I got hold of the 1958 catalogue to the Venice Biennale just to have a look and see what was on offer. And for those listening who maybe have a more traditional classical taste in art, here's a selection of some of the pictures that were on display. And one might agree with Tokenhouse's assessment, where he stands in front of them and says, absurd, preposterous. For these aren't really the sort of thing that he's painting at all. I couldn't find much in terms of 7-foot-high statues that look like samurai armor designed by Schwitters, as Ada describes the statue that where they all meet. But these are the only two from the catalogue that come remotely close to that. But nevertheless, meet they do, and Nick and Tokenhouse collide with Ada and Glober. And very soon the talk turns to those of the cubist blocks, which I also want you to remember for a little bit later. Tokenhouse remembers that Glober was the man who was putting up a series for the cubist blocks, a book that never was printed in the end, but there was a row about the cubist blocks, and Tokenhouse bought them at his own cost and still owned them to this day. So off they trot to lunch. Now, Tokenhouse had originally wanted to lunch just with Nick. And here's a nice example of the will in dance, which crops up all the time. And here Glober dominates in its entirety. Not only does he get them to all lunch together, thus being able to enlarge his court, but he makes the abstemious Tokenhouse have an aperitif. He has a little punta me of vermouth beforehand, and Nick even says Glober did not know how much of a triumph this was. Whilst they're all talking about what they should eat, and there's a little reminder about how Ada had educated her husband Quiggin in the arts and speech of fine dining, Tokenhouse is sitting there quite morosely, not used to this sort of company anymore, although he used to be very much a socialite in his publishing days and used to hog the conversation. Here he's sitting there very quiet and orders the most banal, plain dishes in Italy. He just orders spaghetti. Another quick plug, if anyone wants to know more about food and dance, there is another book on the website which one could get, which details all the meals outlined in dance. Anyway, they all order their food, and talk goes towards St. John Clark, because Ada is trying to ventilate him in a general way, trying to get Glober to buy the rights to do a film of him. And she asks whether Tokenhouse had ever published St. John Clark, although she must have known that he didn't publish fiction. And she discovers that there's a fair amount of antipathy towards him from Tokenhouse, partly because he wasn't writing the sort of thing that Tokenhouse liked anyway, and partly because he did behave in a shoddy way regarding the 5,000-word introduction to the Isbista volume, Art of Horace Isbista, that then never materialized. So he's not a St. John Clark fan. On the other hand, when Ada then goes on to lay out her socialist realist credentials, she mentions Len Pugsley, an article that he'd written on Fission years ago, and Tokenhouse is immediately interested to the extent that he writes down the name of the article on a napkin so he can look it up later, although I venture to suggest that there's no one listening here who would get out their pencil and write down an article called Integral Foundations of a Fresh Approach to Art for the Masses. And I think it's a lovely example of AP's humour to give such a mouthful to an article by someone who Bagshaw didn't really want to publish in the first place, and was only being published because he was in a liaison with Gypsy at the time. Anyway, lunch goes on in its merry way. They all drink far too much wine, certainly for Tokenhouse, who then starts becoming very voluble again, almost treading on the bounds of decency. And Glober, to sort of diffuse the situation, suggests that they all go back to see his paintings in the studio, but not after they've had a glass of Strega, thus again imposing his will on the whole company. So off they trot back to the flat, and Tokenhouse is by this stage very excited, because it's very rare that he gets a chance to expound on his own principles and theories of art to a essentially captive and fairly sympathetic audience. And they get in and he starts showing his paintings, and Glober mentions that to him they look as though they may be frescoes, and wonders if there's an influence of Diego Rivera, the Mexican political painter, suggesting that there is some common theme here, as Nick also commented on frescoes earlier. But before the show really gets going, the bell rings, and who should be there but Widmerpool, interrupting the whole thing, bringing an introduction with him and demanding to be let in. And so Tokenhouse sends him in and into the flat and introduces him with a lovely line saying, "Did you say Lord?" Not only is he horrified by the thought that his private view has been shattered by the arrival of this person who clearly has no interest in art whatsoever, but not only that, he's part of the establishment, a lord of all things. Now, on any creative writing course, one is taught, it's almost creative writing 101, to show and not tell. And here in this back at the flat scene, there is one of the most magnificent examples of showing and not telling that I've ever come across. In fact, it's so good, one could miss it because it stretches out over a couple of pages between the two parts of it. When Glober first comes in and he looks upon the painting that he actually ends up buying, he describes it as a shipwreck scene. And then later on, when Tokenhouse is agreeing the deal, he describes or explains that what the picture is actually showing is a poor family on the Vaporetto without a ticket being kicked off. And you wonder what sort of painting style could demonstrate or be confused with both a shipwreck scene and a family being escorted off without a ticket. I think it's a lovely way of AP saying that Tokenhouse's painting really wasn't very good. Anyway, he does sell the picture to Glober for an undisclosed sum, and then ties it up with string and makes the comment that it's good to use your hands. He's not used to using his hands because of his bourgeois upbringing, and then wraps it up in a very un-American newspaper, Unità, and has the lovely little comment saying people don't mind about that sort of thing in this part of Venice, as though anyone minded about that sort of thing in any part of anywhere. But to Tokenhouse, it's a lovely little detail, and he's a man for details. He's a man who is a very precise character. Anyway, they all leave, and he's left to discuss whatever it is he wants to discuss with Widmerpool. And then comes the close of the Tokenhouse appearance with the second phone call, which is just before Nick leaves Venice at the conclusion of the conference. And again, Tokenhouse has forgotten all about the lunch and the Cubist blocks and everything else. And he says, "Oh, I can't be wasting my time with all that." And he's back at work, and you wonder why has he got this intense work ethic? He's up at 6:30 painting. He's a man in his mid to late 70s. He doesn't sell any of his paintings. He's not particularly good at it. He doesn't show them. He doesn't need the money because he is a man of independent means. You wonder why has he got this work ethic? It's some inner force driving him along. In this really short phone call, there are further hints about the passing on of banned materials and books. He says he doesn't need Nick to act as his delivery boy after all. He's quite happy to act as a sort of covert letterbox for Dr. Belkin, again displaying his traveller credentials. And he ends by showing some contempt for Nick's intellectual conference, saying, "So was anything sorted out at your conference?" "No, I didn't think it would be," dismissing it in a single line. And thus Tokenhouse fades from dance and from our view. So hang on, you're thinking, "Oh, that's 25 minutes. And I booked for an hour. I want my money back, even though that was a free ticket." Panic not, there's plenty more. But I do have a little confession, which is that the rest of much of the rest of the talk is only obliquely Tokenhouse, because I want to now focus on the man who was, I think, the real life model for Tokenhouse. And I know it's not a terribly fashionable thing, but I think there are such similarities between the character and life of this man that he is worthy of our attention for the next half hour or so. In fact, I can't think of anyone else in dance apart from maybe the Trapnell, McLaren Ross, and of course Nick and AP links where the parallels are so good. And I refer, of course, to Thomas Balston. I want to go through those aspects of his life that I was able to ascertain after various bits of research, and show you some incidents, patterns that weave in and out of his life through Tokenhouses and through APs. Now, Thomas Balston, born in the second half of the Victorian era, was definitely a man who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was born in Bearsted in Kent to the wealthy Watman paper-making family. There's the Watman paper mill at the top right of the screen. And grandfather Richard died when Thomas was still a young boy, leaving a very considerable fortune. He had 4 children, but because one son was dead and 2 daughters didn't inherit very much, the majority of it went to William, Thomas's father. And although although Thomas was one of many, he was born into a household that had its fair share of servants, with a governess, a cook, parlourmaid, housemaid, and nurse. He clearly wasn't struggling at the beginning of his life, nor for much of it, as I'll show. Following the well-trodden path of the upper middle classes, he then went to Eton, was a King's Scholar, so lived in. And I want to show some of the books that he published later on in the presentation, but I wanted to just highlight this one at this stage. So at the age of 69, he publishes a biography of his great uncle, who was a previous headmaster at Eton. And the reason I wanted to highlight this was because of this little paragraph in the middle. As regards the greatcoats, I well remember a cold Sunday in 1865 when the Thames was frozen over. Few us big boys determined to walk into chapel with greatcoats. Nothing was said, and from that day forth, greatcoats were universally worn. And I like to think that in some idle hour at Duckworth's, when he and AP were chewing the fat, he might have regaled that little incident or showed it to him. And in some way, it percolated through to what became Widmerpoole's coat. As I said, I do like making links that may not be valid. Again, following the well-trodden path, he then goes from Eton to Oxford, goes to New College, where he had an entirely undistinguished staid career. And when I asked the archivist at New College what they had on him, what you see on the screen is everything they had on him. He joined age 19, read classics, got a scholarship, and graduated in 1906 with a second-class BA in classics, and that was it. We know nothing more about any scandals or awards or accolades or anything else during that time. However, life got a little more interesting after that, because on leaving Oxford, he went to Rome to become a tutor to 2 sons of an Italian senator. They were aged 14 and 16 at the time. Although the father isn't of much interest, the mother is pictured here. Contessa Gabriella Spalletti Rasponi. I mean, I think that's just worth saying of its own accord, isn't it? But she was the granddaughter of Napoleon's sister, a very formidable lady. And she was the first president of the Institute of Culture and Psychic Therapy, later to become the Institute of Psychosynthesis, to which end she also invited every Thursday afternoon lots of representatives of the arts and humanities and politics to a very active salon, all of which Bolston would have been privy to. And again, I like to think that in another quiet hour at Duckworth's, he might have talked to AP about this, and the whole idea of psychic therapy and psychosynthesis may again have been distilled into some aspects of General Conyers in The Kindly Ones. I mean, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he seemed to be continually eating with silver cutlery, because this is where he lived, in the Villa Spalletti in Rome, for 2 years. And then when he came back to England, he was called to the bar. And in many documents and forms that you find researching his life, he is listed as Thomas Bolston Barrister. But in actual fact, he only spent 3 years doing that before he then changed tack and started what was to be his career for the majority of the rest of his life, that in publishing and printing. And he became secretary to T. Fisher Unwin. And at that stage met the first of many people, influential people in the literary world, and met Edward Garrett, probably one of the most influential readers and critics of the early 20th century, responsible for bringing thousands of books to market. There he is, sporting a highly unlikely hairstyle in the bottom right. But of course, the Great War intervened, and he joined the Gloucestershire Regiment as a 1 pip, second lieutenant, no rights, as you'll recall. And in November 1915, moved to France, was rapidly promoted to captain, and transferred to the general list and posted to an infantry brigade, with whom he then saw action at the Somme, for which he was later awarded the Military Cross. And he also was then appointed to DAAG, a post in the army with which I think all members of the society are very familiar, Deputy Assistant Adjutant General, first of all to a division, and then later on, when he was promoted to Major, performed the same function to a corps. And after the war ended, he stayed on in the army and was awarded an OBE for all his work there. And it reminds me very much of Fairbrother's OBE, which he said he should be wearing on his backside because that's how he got it, by sitting on his backside. I rather think that that's probably how he got his OBE, in sharp contradistinction to his military cross. He was reattached to the Gloucesters and returned to the general list in a sort of ping pong of military attachments. He was then awarded the 1914-15 Star. You can see that medal on the left-hand side for anyone who was in France or Belgium at that time. And that medal was always given as one of a triumvirate. There was also the British War Medal and the Victory Medal, which is the other two in the picture. The reason I show this is not really to show off his medals, but to look at the other side of that card as a little rabbit hole to dive into just for a moment. As you'll notice that he gave his civilian address as the Union Club, Trafalgar Square. Now, the Union Club, no longer, it was disbanded in 1964 when it ran out of cash. The Union Club was one of the most peripatetic clubs in St James's Clubland history, as it had at least 5 addresses in its 165-year history, constantly being moved on. But just at that time, it was in Trafalgar Square, before the Canadian High Commission bought it in 1994, and they're, of course, still there in that building. It seemed an unusual club for Bolston to join, however, because it had a reputation for having the most fabulous wine cellar in Clubland and for its members being gluttonous, all of which isn't really in Bolston's or Tokenhouse's character, I'd have thought. Interestingly, in terms of disposable income, around that time, it cost 30 guineas to join the Union Club, which equates to about £2,500 in today's money, and 6 guineas a year subscription. It's about £300 a year, which is quite modest for a London club these days. But certainly at that time, he was a member there, gave that as his main address. Then, of course, he joins Duckworth. And is there for some 13 years, and he's brought in to modernise the business, which he does. He attracts this Edith Sitwell, and publishes Sitwelliana. But from our point of view, of course, his most important activity there was to publish, or be instrumental in publishing, AP's first book, Afternoon Men. And they, clearly friends. He even had A View to a Death dedicated to him. We meet Tokenhouse in Venice. There's no particular reference to Bolston ever going to Venice, but he certainly travelled. Here he is in 1922, taking a cruise to Madeira. He took the same journey again in 1934, shortly before his row with Duckworth. Here in 1925, he's taken a cruise to Kingston, Jamaica. So there's certainly a man who has a degree of disposable income to be able to take cruises like that in the 1920s. Probably the most famous incident that members will know about whilst he was working at Duckworth is the incident with Inez Holden, who charmed him really to publish her first novel, Sweet Charlatan. Bolston had little or no experience with women, very much like Tokenhouse, and it seems to have been a bit of a pushover. Now, Sweet Charlatan is a virtually impossible novel to get hold of, and I just want at this point to pay tribute to Ariane Banks, who is the daughter of Celia Goodman, who was Inez Holden's cousin, and the rights of Inez Holden's estate have passed down to her. And she was very kind enough to send me her copy of Sweet Charlatan to read. Very trusting, just sent it through the post saying, oh, just please send it back. Which I did, of course. And I have to say, it isn't a very good novel, but it's virtually unobtainable, and I think it's only available in about 6 libraries across the world. Even her second one, Born Old, Died Young, you can get on aid books for about £700, though I haven't splashed out on that one myself. She's, of course, also the prototype for Roberta Payne, and Bolston's the prototype for Judkin, Bernd Judkin, where again he's inveigled into publishing activities that you might not otherwise have wanted to undertake. Anyway, there he is publishing Sweet Charlatan for her, and it got good reviews. Even War reviewed it as well. I think she held charm over many people at that time. He did have a more serious side to his publishing. Here is Poems by Pinchbeck Lyre, which was, of course, Siegfried Sassoon. There's some letters in that batch that show how much attention to detail he showed in regard to his publishing. Here he's talking about proof copies. Here, before the publication, he's making lists of people to whom to send the book in order to maximize publicity. He's a very professional publisher. He goes off the radar a fair bit, but we do see him on the 8th of December 1932, where he's chairing the 35th dinner of the Double Crown Club at the Café Royal. Now, the Double Crown Club was founded in 1924 and was a dining club for people like Bolston, printers, publishers, book designers, illustrators. And I think it's a club that I would very much like to belong to, because it was founded in 1924. And here we are in 1932 having the 35th dinner. That means they're kind of having one with the change of every season. And at the Café Royal to boot. And in this particular one, it included a paper delivered by Stanley Morrison, a name that will crop up again later on. Stanley Morrison was a typographer instrumental in creating Times New Roman, and another man who crops up in Bolston's story, and they've remained friends for the rest of their lives. In 1934, by which time he's obviously been painting for some time, he has a one-man exhibition at the Redfern Gallery in Old Bond Street. The Redfern Gallery is now moved to Pall Mall. They had promised to send me some details about what pictures he had, but they still haven't. If they ever do, I'll post this on the AP list. But he was clearly thought significant enough an artist to have a one-man exhibition in a small West End gallery. Here are some examples of his paintings. These wouldn't have been shown, of course, because they were painted after the Redfern Gallery exhibition. Very precise, very stylistic, very much speaking of the character of the man. Attention to detail, but maybe not dramatic artistic flair. These two hang in, or they're held by New College, Oxford, and they kindly sent me the JPEGs of these two. Slightly better watercolours, but all of essentially still life. Shortly before the war, he's attending a reunion meeting of his old regiment. But then comes the war, and despite being age 56, he rejoins on the general list, but isn't able to participate for very long. He's retired due to ill health, pneumonia, sort of reminiscent of Tokenhouse, who can't take part in the Second War, but because of a psychiatric illness. The parallels are obvious. Now, before the war, Bolston had bought a considerable property in Berkshire, Holt End, several acres in a big house where he lived until the end of his life. You can see a register at the bottom there when he's aged 83, so a year before he dies, where he's living there with Laura, his sister, and still a small establishment, a housekeeper, a dressmaker, presumably it's part-time, and a gardener. Now, you remember the directions that Tokenhouse gave to Nick to get to his flat. Well, how's this? Here he is writing to Graham Pollard, a bookseller, amongst other things, from his Holt End, and he's describing to Graham how to get there. The 10:20 is supposed to get to Reading at 10:58. Turn to the right directly you get into the station yard and you'll find the Newbury bus. One starts at 11:24, but there's another at 11:54, 12:24, etc. Get off at the Angel Woolhampton, 30 minutes, where I will meet you. If on arrival at Oxford Station you learn that the 10:20 is indefinitely delayed, it might be a good thing to take the 10:10, a slow train. It takes an hour or more to get to Reading, but has the advantage of being nearly empty. Now, if ever there was an instance of a prototype letter being transposed into fiction, I would suggest that that is it. And that AP was aware of this, maybe not this letter, but certainly this characteristic, and just gave it to Tokenhouse in its entirety. So I promised you more books that Bolston published, or rather wrote, I should say, in the 40s and 50s. Now, he was very interested in John Martin, the 1947 book, painter, and I'll talk more about him in a moment. But he also, before that, wrote about Jonathan Martin, his younger brother. Jonathan Martin, the sailor and then Methodist preacher who hid in York Minster and burnt it down, or burnt the choir down anyway, because of his disgust at the profligacy of the clerics there. And he wrote a biography of Jonathan Martin, which he published. And he said he did it partly because he found the story so fascinating, but partly because quote, "We never really get an insight into the lives of the poor," showing a very sort of enlightened attitude to social history. But he wrote it really because he was the brother of John Martin. His parents obviously ran out of names after they'd named Richard and William, the elder two, and then just stuck to John. And John Martin was a painter, which I'll come on to in a moment. But all his other books, again, revolve around printing, wood graving, the paper business, and then his own collection of Staffordshire portrait figures. So his Life of John Martin, which he did publish, was illustrated, but there was also, at the same time, he was in negotiation with King Penguin Books and wanted to produce a larger volume, reproducing engravings that John Martin had done representing scenes from Paradise Lost. And King Penguin Books were originally very interested in it, but for reasons that I think in this case were technical, not commercial, because the printing wasn't very successful, so not quite the same parallel as the Cubist blocks. But nevertheless, the book wasn't published. And again, I wonder whether AP knew of this and transposed that episode into the blocks for Tokenhouse to acquire. I'm sure you all know Mark Gertler, painter. Bolston had an unusual relationship with him insofar as he both studied under him and then later on became his patron. And here are some examples of Gertler's work, and I'll let you recall Nick's descriptions of Tokenhouse's painting that was greys, browns, and thick black lines, and wondered whether there were at all any influences from Mark Gertler there. Mark Gertler was an intense egoist. Virginia Woolf apparently once said one spent 30 hours with him and it was like seeing a molehill in magnificent detail, but the rest of the world didn't exist. And she thought he could become a good painter, but it would require a rupture of the brain. He was the prototype for the figure Gombol in Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow. He underwent many stylistic changes in his career, progressed to modernisms, and, like Tokenhouse, often painted subjects from different angles. And I wonder whether that little nugget percolated via Bolston through to Tokenhouse. Here are some of Gertler's better-known paintings. There's Dora Carrington, top left, a woman he had an undying passion for, largely unrequited. His most famous one is the merry-go-round, of which the central figures are embossed in lead in the pavement outside his old home in Spitalfields. But his link with Bolston is represented by the middle two pictures. The top one is called A View from the Window at Holt End, and the lower one is the entrance to Holt End. So he stayed with Bolston, whose portrait he painted there in 1921. So the two of them were friendly enough for weekend stays, weekend visits. He continues much the same vein in his 60s, arranging exhibits of wood engravings, writing a pamphlet about the Kirwin Press, and covering the entire career of Harold Kirwin, grandson of the founder, and a man who was in the vanguard of novel design for printing. And even his correspondence. Here he is writing to Graham Pollard again, saying, "Dear Graham, many thanks for the size of the sheet. I found it most interesting. I was amazed at the amount of research you digested." Even his correspondence is about matters of paper, printing, publishing. But look where he's writing from. He's writing from his London flat, 3 Whitehall Court. Whitehall Court being just around the corner from the National Liberal Club, where we had the 25th luncheon last year. And look who lives at number 2, but Stanley Morrison, the typographer who was at the Double Crown Club dinner before, and his lifelong friend. Again, what are they writing about? As you perceive, my pen runs smoothly and pleasantly on these excellent sheets of mould-made 1948 vintage. They're still talking about paper. Even in his dotage, he's still writing about wood engravings, writing pamphlets, and his writing there is paralleled by Tokenhouse, painting until the very end. And all good things do come to an end, and he died at the age of 84, and he left a considerable collection of art to the nation. Much of it is at the V&A and the Ashmolean, some elsewhere. And there are all sorts of things there. I mean, he had a little drawing from Evelyn Waugh, signed drawing from Evelyn Waugh. My favourite one is this Camden Town Group painting by Charles Ginner called Covent Garden, which actually sold at Christie's in 2013 for £50,000. And I like to think that he bought this one because it reminded him exactly of the view from number 3 Henrietta Street, where he worked at Duckworth's. So there we are, the life of Thomas Balston, very closely paralleled by the life of Daniel Tokenhouse. Printer, painter, soldier, spy. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll try and answer them. If you have any comments, I'll try and survive them. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Bernard. That was wonderful. Very, very interesting. And I'm amazed how much you've managed to dig out about Balston. Because I've had admittedly a fairly desultory look in the past and not found a lot. So if you maybe would unshare your screen,
yes.
Bernard, then we can have everybody on the
right, hang on. Here we go.
Lovely, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so questions, discussion. Jason's already got his hand up, I noticed. So Jason, over to you first.
Thank you, Keith. So that was amazing. I agree, and very enjoyable. My question is sort of looking ahead to the Society's conference in Scotland on the topic of AP and the occult next year. You mentioned that Balston is an inspiration for the Hugh Judkins character in What's Become of Waring, which is one of my favorite non-dance novels by Powell.
Mine too.
And the Judkins character there is, Atwater's boss at the publishing house, and he'd been a school headmaster. And you already pointed out that these are points in common with the real Balston. And so the question is, the other big aspect of the Judson character is that he was interested in the occult. And it was sort of through him that the Atwater character was introduced to seances and the visitations and all of that, which is sort of the engine of the plot of that novel. And I was wondering if Balston, if you've come across Balston also having an interest in the occult, or whether that was, sort of added by Powell.
No, I think that was very much added by Powell. Everything I found about Balston really made him a very staid, prosaic character. I think he was the sort of man who would chase after you on the street if he found that you dropped a penny. He was honest to a T. He was diligent. He was obviously clever, but I think he wasn't someone who had a rich imagination, and there's certainly no records of him attending seances or even taking that side of life any further. The reason I mentioned his time in Rome there was just as a tease, really, that he may have brought some ideas of psychological therapy back home, and maybe AP heard about it, and maybe it influenced Conyers and other characters. But no, Balston himself is not a direct match for Judkins in that respect at all. It was not his world.
I think it's fairly certain that Powell got most of his occult interest via his mother, who was very much into that sort of thing. I mean, yes, he met people like Crowley as well, Mr. Crowley, and so on. But and in fact, Trelawney is drawn from pretty much from life of somebody AP came across.
Well,
whose name
Aleister Crowley, isn't he?
No, it's escaped me now, but no, yeah. I mean, he if you read the bit in at the beginning, Kindly Ones, in the flashback, that cult leader we come across there is drawn very closely from a real character there at the time. So yeah. Anybody else? Oh, nobody, nothing. I mean, what occurred to me while you were talking, Bernard, was that Balston seems to go off on, into Europe doing all sorts of things, and comes back and is immediately called to the bar. I mean, how did that happen in those days? I mean, these days you've got, I don't know how much legal training you have to do to get there. From what you said, there was no sign of any legal training.
No, I mean, I think there was no sign of a conversion degree, certainly. I mean, I think in those days different rules applied, and it was very much a case of who you know and connections. I mean, how else would he have got a 2-year tutoring post to an Italian senator's family? I mean, I'm sure that wasn't advertised in the agony of the Times, was it?
Yeah.
I think that was friends of a friend, and you have to bear in mind that he came from a seriously wealthy family, and they would have had connections. I think that's how things worked back then. It's not like now where you have to have qualifications for everything, except for politicians who need none.
Okay, yeah, of course. I mean, yes. Alf.
Yeah, hello. Recalling the photograph of Inez Holdham, do you know any of the other characters in that photograph? Particularly the lady on the right seems familiar somehow.
The lady on the right, I think.
On the left, sorry.
Hang on, let me just see if I can find that. It is actually detailed. It's very easy to find on the internet if you want to.
Oh, right. Yeah.
From memory, I think that may be Tallulah Bankhead. I think I can't find it immediately, but I think even Wikipedia has that and has a list of characters. But I think it's Tallulah Bankhead.
Right. Thanks.
Elwyn.
Unmute. Done it.
Yes.
Mastered the technology. Yeah, great. No, Bernard, thank you very much for a really interesting talk, which was illuminating to say the least. Look, on a lighter note, and I was sort of interested, obviously, by when you raised his very precise directions of how to get to Tokenhouse's flat in Venice. When we actually had the Venice conference, I attempted to follow them until sort of common sense finally prevailed, because I realised the final step would end in a canal. Then left, right. But which in a way is interesting, though, because there were some things later I thought that Powell would be very precise about some of his directions. In, for example, Buyer's Market, where after the Huntercomb's ball, when he and Widmerpool walked to Grosvenor Place before bumping into Deacon, that's very precise in terms of distance, in terms of time and everything. But so as I always thought, well, it's easy enough for him to go back when he's writing that book to London and actually pace it out and work it out. But he wasn't going to take a flight to Venice to get it absolutely accurate, and so it was a bit more impressionistic about the approach.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he's just trying to highlight a character trait. He's not giving a blueprint to an abandoned studio here. And maybe he even didn't want people to go traipsing along there if he thought that far ahead. But it's clearly a device just to highlight a character trait.
No, I think you're right. That's exactly what it is about that. And in fact, you demonstrated that through the letter that you showed for Bolston doing precisely that sort of thing.
When I read it, I couldn't believe that the parallels there. It was a lovely find.
Okay, anybody else? Any more? Bernard, I think you've sort of flooded everybody's brains with so much good stuff.
Oh, well, as long as I enjoyed it.
Okay. Nobody else? I mean, interesting to me as well that you managed to actually pull up quite a few of Bolston's books, because I must admit I've always found the sort of AP Bolston relationship quite interesting, and Bolston as well. I mean, and that's partly because my father's family come from roughly the same sort of area of Kent, so paper making, cloth working down there, it's all tied up, and that's quite interesting. So and that's one reason I found Bolston interesting. What I hadn't realised is that he was part of the Watman family. So even more interesting.
Yeah. what's interesting is the sums that are left. So as I said, 45 million for his grandfather.
Yeah.
When poor old Mark Gertler died, he left the princely sum of £361, which is still, it's £30,000 in today's money, but the differences are just extraordinary amongst his contemporaries.
I mean, the other thing that interested me was the Gertler paintings that you showed, how similar they are to the cover of your book, your recreation of the Tokenhouse book.
Well, I did have a happy time trying to recreate that. I mean, I have no painting skills whatever, so I had to outsource that. But there's an artist in Scotland with whom I had an extremely long exchange about exactly what I wanted, who absolutely put her heart and soul into that to try and recreate my idea of what it was. And the hardest thing was to try and persuade a good painter to paint badly.
Yes. And I actually thought that the image on the screen when you showed it was much better than it is printed on the actual cover of the book.
Oh, okay.
And I got more out of it on the screen tonight.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at it here in my dining room.
Oh, right.
Hangs there all the time.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, Keith, if you'd just be kind and draw Bernard's attention to the messages of appreciation on the chat, please.
Oh, I see. That's very kind of everyone. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It was a great talk, Bernard. Congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you again, Bernard. I guess we'll wrap it up there, and we'll meet again. When is it? Next month. 10th of June. Same Wednesday, same time, and Colin Donald's talking about Private Bracey, which equally, a small, lesser known character, but could be very interesting. And a week or so after that, our next social call is on Saturday, the 20th of June. Before we go, Bernard or John Moyson, who's on somewhere, any sort of words from Chairman, Secretary, announcements, whatever?
Well, I'd just like to say, as the lifestyle editor, Keith, thank you very much for your customary excellent facilitation.
Thank you.
Well, I would just maybe like to announce, because it only arrived to me this week. As some members may know, we've been trying to pedal AP towards the A-level curriculum, and I've been writing to the various exam boards, and we had a sort of fairly warm response from the Welsh board, a chilly one from the Northern Irish one, a fairly warm one from the Oxford and Cambridge one. And yesterday, I had a letter from AQA, who are by far the largest exam board. Very long, very nice letter from their chief executive promising to put AP onto the list for the next considering novels, and they will remember the society and get back in contact when they have their next review, which I think he said would be in 2 or 3 years' time. So again, very positive. Brilliant.
Well done. Excellent. The other thing I will say is that those of you who were interested in the Albury weekend based around Oxford, there are still places available. You should all have had at least one, probably 2 emails with the details, so do get signed up. And if there are places still free at the end of the month or beginning of next month, we'll throw them open. I'm not quite sure how, John Blackster, we're going to do that, but we will find a way of doing it. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll meet again in a month's time.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.